The sun hung low on the horizon, casting an orange glow across the quiet suburban streets. It was the kind of evening when the world seemed to slow down, the perfect time for a peaceful stroll. For Lisa, this walk wasn't just a way to unwind. It was her daily ritual, a chance to clear her mind and breathe in the fresh air after hours of work. Dressed in a simple hoodie and sneakers, she wasn't expecting anything out of the ordinary that evening. But as she turned onto a narrow, deserted road that cut through the outskirts of town, a distant rumble of engines shattered the tranquility. At first, she dismissed it as nothing more than a few motorcycles passing by. After all, this was a popular route for bikers heading toward the open highway. But as the sound grew louder and closer, Lisa noticed something unusual. The roar wasn't fading away, it was surrounding her. Her heart quickened as she glanced over her shoulder. That's when she saw them. A group of 5 burly bikers cruising down the street, their silhouettes looming large against the fading light. They weren't just passing through. They were slowing down. Lisa kept walking, forcing herself to stay calm. Maybe they're just here for the ride, she thought, though the nagging feeling in her gut told her otherwise. The bikers, clad in leather jackets with bold patches on their backs, formed a loose semicircle around her. Their engines growled, echoing off the empty buildings. One of them, a man with a scruffy beard and a cigarette dangling from his lips, revved his engine loudly, making Lisa flinch. "Hey there, sweetheart," he called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "Out here all alone, huh?" Lisa didn't respond. She wasn't the type to engage with strangers, especially ones that seemed intent on making her uncomfortable. Instead, she kept her pace steady, her eyes focused on the path ahead. But the bikers weren't about to let her go so easily. Another rider, younger and cockier, pulled up closer. "What's the rush? We just want to chat," he sneered, his grin wide and unsettling. Lisa clenched her fists, her mind racing. She knew she couldn't outrun them, and confronting them directly seemed like a bad idea. But she also refused to let fear take over. She had been through her fair share of challenges in life, situations that had taught her how to stay composed under pressure. The leader of the group, a tall man with piercing eyes and a patch that read, "Reaper," leaned forward on his handlebars. "Not much of a talker, are you?" he said, his tone cold and commanding. "Well, that's fine. We can keep you company for a while." The group erupted in laughter, their voices bouncing off the empty street. Lisa's pulse quickened, but she kept her expression neutral. She knew that any sign of panic would only embolden them further. As the group tightened their circle around her, blocking her path, she realized there was no easy way out of this situation. But Lisa wasn't your average woman. Beneath her calm exterior lay a fiery determination, a resolve forged through years of standing up for herself and those she cared about. She wasn't about to let a group of strangers dictate her evening or her life. As the tension thickened, Lisa stopped walking and turned to face the group. Her sudden movement caught them off guard, and for a brief moment, silence fell over the scene. The bikers exchanged glances, their smirks faltering ever so slightly. "What's wrong?" the younger rider taunted, his voice wavering just a bit. "Cat got your tongue?" Lisa's gaze locked onto him, steady and unflinching. She took a deep breath, her mind calculating her next move. What she did next would not only catch the bikers off guard, it would leave them utterly speechless. Lisa stood her ground, her eyes scanning each of the bikers as the heavy silence weighed on the air. They were used to intimidation working. Most people would have faltered by now. But Lisa wasn't most people. She had learned long ago that fear only gave others power over you. If there was one thing she had promised herself, it was never to let anyone take that from her again. The leader, Reaper, tilted his head slightly, studying her. He seemed to sense there was more to her than met the eye, but he wasn't about to back down. Instead, he smirked, as if amused by her defiance. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But guts only get you so far, lady." Lisa didn't respond. Her silence wasn't out of fear, it was deliberate. She had learned the power of observation, of letting others reveal their hand before she made her move. And right now, she was taking in every detail. The way their bikes formed a barrier, the glances they exchanged, the subtle shifts in their body language. What the bikers didn't know was that Lisa had faced worse situations before. She had grown up in a tough neighborhood where standing up for yourself wasn't just a skill, it was a necessity. From a young age, she had learned to navigate tricky situations with both her wit and her instincts. As the tension lingered, Lisa's mind briefly wandered to her brother, Jack. He had been the one to teach her how to stay calm under pressure. "Never let them see you sweat," he used to say with a grin. Jack was a Marine, and his stories of perseverance and resilience had left a lasting impression on her. Though he had passed away a few years ago, his lessons lived on in her. She could almost hear his voice in her head now, steady and reassuring. "You can handle this, sis," she imagined him saying. The younger biker revved his engine again, snapping Lisa out of her thoughts. "What's the matter? Cat still got your tongue?" he jeered, trying to get a reaction out of her. Lisa's lips curled into the faintest hint of a smile, a gesture so subtle that it made the group uneasy. The leader's smirk faded slightly, replaced by a flicker of curiosity. He leaned back on his bike, folding his arms as if to say, "All right, show me what you've got." What they didn't realize was that Lisa wasn't just stalling for time. She was calculating. A few feet away, she noticed a small alleyway that could serve as an escape route if needed. She also took note of the streetlights, which were beginning to flicker on, casting long shadows across the pavement. She finally spoke, her voice calm and measured. "You're wasting your time." Her words hung in the air, simple yet commanding. The bikers exchanged puzzled glances, clearly not expecting such a confident response. "Wasting our time?" Reaper repeated, his tone laced with mockery. "And what makes you think that?" Lisa took a step forward, her gaze unwavering. "Because you don't know who you're dealing with." The statement was cryptic, but it was enough to sow seeds of doubt in the group. Lisa wasn't bluffing, she had skills and connections that could turn the tide in her favor, but she wasn't about to reveal her hand just yet. The youngest biker, emboldened by her calm demeanor, tried to step in closer, but Reaper raised a hand, stopping him. "Hold up," he said, his eyes narrowing as he studied Lisa. "She's got guts, sure, but that doesn't mean we're backing down." Lisa's mind raced, weighing her options. She didn't want to escalate the situation, but she also couldn't let them think they had the upper hand. She decided to shift the dynamic. "You think you're in control here," she said, her tone steady. "But you're not. You're just a group of guys trying to prove something, and for what? To scare a stranger on the street?" Her words struck a nerve. One of the bikers muttered something under his breath, and Reaper shot him a warning glance. The group's bravado was starting to crack, and Lisa could see it. "You don't know anything about us," Reaper said, his voice sharp. "Maybe not," Lisa replied, "but I know enough. You're not as tough as you act. If you were, you wouldn't need a group to intimidate one person." The younger biker, clearly agitated, spoke up. "Who do you think you are, talking to us like that?" Lisa locked eyes with him. "I'm someone who's not afraid of you." Her words were like a challenge, daring them to make their next move. The group fell silent again, the weight of her confidence unsettling them. Even Reaper seemed momentarily at a loss for how to respond. Lisa knew she couldn't let the situation drag on much longer. She needed to find a way to defuse it or create an opening to escape. Her mind raced through possible scenarios, each one hinging on her ability to stay calm and focused. Just then, a sound in the distance caught everyone's attention, a faint but distinct siren. The bikers tensed, their heads turning toward the source. Lisa seized the opportunity, her heart pounding as she prepared to act. But she wasn't out of the woods yet. The bikers' attention snapped back to her, and their expressions hardened. Reaper leaned forward again, his eyes narrowing. "You're lucky," he said, his voice low and menacing. "But luck runs out." With that, he revved his engine, signaling to the others. The group hesitated for a moment before following his lead, their bikes roaring as they sped off into the night. Lisa stood frozen, her pulse racing as she watched them disappear down the road. The tension that had gripped her finally began to release, and she let out a shaky breath. She knew this wasn't over, not by a long shot. As the siren grew louder, Lisa glanced around, her mind already working through what had just happened. She wasn't sure why the bikers had chosen her or what their true intentions were, but one thing was certain: she wouldn't let fear control her. The night was far from over, and Lisa had a feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger. Lisa lingered for a moment, staring down the empty street where the bikers had vanished. Her hands were trembling, though she clenched them tightly to hide the shake. The roar of their engines had faded into the night, but their words and menacing stares lingered in her mind like a shadow that wouldn't let go. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. This wasn't the first time she'd faced intimidation, But something about the encounter felt different, more deliberate, almost calculated. She couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't just chosen her at random. The distant wail of the siren grew louder, cutting through the silence of the street. Moments later, a police cruiser appeared at the end of the block, its lights flashing faintly. Lisa watched as it slowly rolled toward her, the officer inside scanning the area. When the car stopped beside her, the window rolled down, revealing a middle-aged officer with sharp eyes and a calm demeanor. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" he asked, his voice steady but concerned. Lisa hesitated. She wasn't sure how much to say. Reporting the bikers might escalate things. If they found out she'd called the police, they could come back. But keeping quiet didn't sit right with her either. "There was a group of bikers," she said finally, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through her veins. "They surrounded me back there. They didn't hurt me, but they were trying to intimidate me." The officer frowned, nodding as he took in her words. "Did you get a good look at them? Any details you can share?" Lisa thought back to the leader's piercing eyes, the patches on their jackets, the younger one's cocky grin. "There were 5 of them," she said. "Leather jackets, loud bikes. The leader had a patch on his back, it said, Reaper." The officer's expression shifted subtly, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Reaper, huh?" he murmured, almost to himself. He leaned back slightly, glancing down the road where Lisa had gestured. "Do you know them?" Lisa asked, catching the change in his tone. The officer hesitated, then nodded. "We've had run-ins with that crew before. They're part of a local biker group that's been causing trouble around here. Nothing too serious, mostly petty intimidation and minor disturbances. But their leader, he's got a bit of a reputation." Lisa's stomach tightened at his words. So it wasn't just her imagination, this wasn't random. "They didn't hurt me," she said quickly, "but they made it clear they were trying to scare me. I don't know why." The officer nodded again, his brow furrowed. "You did the right thing by staying calm," he said. "And it's good you told me. We'll keep an eye out for them." He handed her a card with his name and number. "If you see them again or if anything else happens, call me. And if you can, try to avoid walking alone in these quieter areas, at least for now." Lisa nodded, taking the card. "Thank you," she said, though the unease in her chest hadn't lifted. The officer gave her a reassuring nod before driving off, his cruiser disappearing down the street. Lisa stood there for a moment, clutching the card tightly. She didn't like the idea of avoiding her usual routes, she refused to let fear dictate her life. But she also couldn't ignore the strange tension that had settled over her. As she turned and headed home, her mind raced with questions. Why had they singled her out? Was it really just random intimidation, or was there more to it? And what was it about the name, Reaper, that made the officer's expression shift like that? By the time Lisa reached her house, the quiet of her cozy living room felt almost surreal. She locked the door behind her, double-checking it before setting her keys on the table. The soft hum of the refrigerator and the glow of the kitchen light felt worlds away from the cold, tense energy of the street she'd just left. Lisa grabbed a glass of water and sat at the small dining table, her mind still spinning. Her phone buzzed, pulling her attention. It was a message from her best friend, Clara. Asterisk, how was your walk? Everything okay? For a moment, Lisa considered brushing it off, just saying it was fine and leaving it at that. But Clara had known her for years, and Lisa knew she'd see through any attempt to downplay what had happened. Asterisk, it was fine, until it wasn't. Asterisk, Lisa typed back. Asterisk, I'll call you in the morning. Long story. The reply came almost immediately. Asterisk, what happened? Are you okay? Lisa smiled faintly. Clara's concern was comforting, but she didn't want to rehash the whole thing over text. Asterisk, I'm fine. Asterisk, she wrote back. Asterisk, I'll explain tomorrow, I promise. After setting her phone down, Lisa leaned back in her chair, staring out the window into the dark night. The quiet neighborhood looked so peaceful, so ordinary. But beneath that surface, there was something unsettling, a feeling that tonight's encounter was only the beginning. She thought back to Reaper's cold gaze, the way his presence seemed to command the group. There was something about him that felt different from the others, more calculating, more dangerous. And then there was the officer's reaction, the way he'd said, he's got a bit of a reputation. Lisa didn't know what kind of reputation Reaper had, but she had a sinking feeling she was going to find out. For now, though, all she could do was try to push the thoughts aside and get some rest. Tomorrow, she would figure out her next steps. Whether that meant finding out more about the biker crew or simply being more cautious on her walks, she wasn't sure. But one thing was certain: she wouldn't let them scare her into silence. Whatever this was, Lisa was determined to face it head-on, even if it meant standing up to the Reaper himself. The next morning, Lisa woke up with a lingering heaviness in her chest. The sunlight streaming through her curtains did little to erase the events of the previous night. She had always loved her quiet neighborhood, but now it felt different, like the sense of safety she'd always taken for granted had been stripped away. As she poured herself a cup of coffee, her phone buzzed again. It was Clara, as expected. This time, she wasn't letting Lisa off with a vague explanation. The message was short and firm. Call me. Now. Lisa sighed, taking her mug to the couch. She dialed the number and didn't even get through the first ring before Clara picked up. Okay, spill. What happened? Clara's voice was sharp, laced with concern. Lisa hesitated for a moment, then recounted everything: the walk, the bikers, their intimidating behavior, and the strange way the officer had reacted when she mentioned Reaper. She tried to keep her tone light, but Clara wasn't buying it. Lisa, this isn't something you can just brush off, Clara said firmly. These guys sound dangerous. I know, Lisa admitted. But what am I supposed to do? The officer told me to be careful, and I will. I can't just stop living my life because of a bunch of bullies. This is more than just bullying, Clara argued. You said the officer knew who they were. That means they've done stuff like this before, or worse. Maybe you should stay somewhere else for a while. Lisa shook her head, even though Clara couldn't see her. I'm not running, Clara. If I start hiding, they win. And besides, I don't think they'll come back. They had their fun, and they're probably already onto the next thing. Clara didn't sound convinced, but she let it go. Just promise me you'll be careful, she said. And if anything happens, call me. No matter what. I promise, Lisa said, though she wasn't sure how much the promise was worth. After hanging up, Lisa tried to focus on her day. She had a project deadline looming, and burying herself in work seemed like the best way to distract herself. But no matter how hard she tried, her thoughts kept drifting back to the bikers. Who were they, really? And why had they chosen her? By the afternoon, curiosity had gotten the better of her. She opened her laptop and started searching. It didn't take long to find references to a local biker gang called the Reapers. The articles were sparse, but the details were enough to make her uneasy. The group had a history of skirting the law, illegal street races, bar fights, and reports of intimidation like the kind she had experienced. Nothing major, nothing that stuck, but enough to suggest they weren't harmless. What stood out the most, though, was a photograph buried in one of the older articles. It showed a group of bikers gathered in front of a rundown garage, their leather jackets emblazoned with the same skull and scythe logo Lisa had seen the night before. At the center of the group stood a man she recognized instantly: Reaper. The caption identified him as Dominic Reaper Kane, the leader of the Reapers. According to the article, he had taken over the gang a few years ago, transforming them from a loose group of bikers into a more organized, and more feared, presence in the area. Lisa stared at his face, trying to reconcile the cold, calculating man in the photo with the one she'd encountered. There was something about him that unsettled her, something she couldn't quite put her finger on. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. Lisa froze, her heart leaping into her throat. For a moment, she considered not answering, but the knock came again, louder this time. She crept to the door and peered through the peephole. To her relief, it wasn't a biker, it was the police officer from the night before. Lisa opened the door cautiously. Officer Moore, right? She said, remembering his name from the card he'd given her. That's right, he said with a nod. I wanted to check in on you. We spotted a few bikers matching the description you gave us near the highway last night, but they were gone before we could stop them. Lisa's stomach tightened. Do you think they'll come back? It's hard to say, Moore admitted. But I wanted to warn you. This group has a history of pushing boundaries. If they singled you out, it might not have been random. Lisa frowned. What do you mean? Moore hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. The Reapers don't usually target strangers without a reason. It could have been a simple power play, or what? Lisa pressed. Or they might have mistaken you for someone else, he said finally. Either way, I need you to be cautious. Lock your doors, stick to busy areas, and call us if you notice anything suspicious." Lisa nodded, though her mind was already racing. Mistaken identity? That didn't make sense. She hadn't done anything to cross paths with a gang like the Reapers. But the idea planted a seed of doubt, one that only grew as the day went on. By evening, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every time she glanced out the window, she half expected to see the glint of headlights or the shadowy outline of a biker. She tried to tell herself it was just her imagination, but the unease wouldn't go away. As the sun dipped below the horizon, she made a decision. She wasn't going to let fear control her, but she also wasn't going to sit around waiting for something to happen. If the Reapers had targeted her for a reason, she needed to know why. And if they came back, she wanted to be ready. Lisa grabbed her jacket and stepped outside, her nerves taut but her resolve firm. The quiet streets stretched out before her, bathed in the dim glow of the streetlights. She didn't know where this path would lead, but one thing was certain: she wasn't going to back down. The chill of the evening air pressed against Lisa as she walked down the dimly lit street, her heart pounding harder with every step. She told herself it was just a precautionary stroll to clear her head, but deep down, she knew she was searching for answers. Answers to the questions that had haunted her since last night: why the Reapers had targeted her, why their leader, Dominic Kane, had stared at her as if he knew her, and why the officer had seemed reluctant to share everything he knew. The streets were unusually quiet. The usual hum of distant traffic and occasional footsteps had been replaced by an almost oppressive silence. Lisa kept glancing over her shoulder, her instincts sharper than ever. Every shadow seemed to shift, every rustle in the wind set her nerves on edge. Yet, she pressed on, determined not to let fear dictate her actions. Her route took her toward the outskirts of town, where the buildings were sparser and the streetlights dimmer. It wasn't a place she'd usually venture at night, but something about it felt like the right direction, as if she were being pulled there. Just as she rounded a corner, the low, unmistakable growl of a motorcycle engine rumbled in the distance. Lisa froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound grew louder, then multiplied, the distinct echo of multiple bikes cutting through the still night. Lisa instinctively stepped into the shadows, her heart racing. Moments later, the bikes came into view. 5 of them, just as she remembered. They cruised down the street slowly, their headlights piercing the darkness, their engines a menacing chorus. At the front of the group was Dominic, Reaper, Kane, his presence as commanding as it had been the night before. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears as she pressed herself against the wall of a nearby building, hoping they wouldn't notice her. But just as they passed, Dominic turned his head, his sharp eyes locking onto her hiding spot. He didn't stop, didn't say anything, but his gaze lingered for a second too long before he continued down the street. Lisa stayed frozen in place until the sound of the bikes faded into the distance. She exhaled shakily, her mind racing. He had seen her, there was no doubt about it. But why hadn't he stopped? Was he trying to send a message, or was it something else entirely? Lisa's thoughts swirled as she hurried back toward the busier parts of town, her nerves still on edge. When she reached the relative safety of her neighborhood, she noticed a figure leaning against a lamppost near her building. Her initial reaction was fear, but as she got closer, she recognized the familiar uniform. It was Officer Moore. He straightened when he saw her, his expression a mix of concern and urgency. "Lisa," he said, his tone serious. "What are you doing out here?" "I could ask you the same thing," she replied, though her voice wavered slightly. Moore sighed, glancing around as if checking for anyone else nearby. "I've been keeping an eye on this area since last night. We've had a couple more reports about the Reapers, and I didn't want to take any chances." "You shouldn't be out here alone." Lisa hesitated, debating whether to tell him about what had just happened. But before she could decide, Moore spoke again. "There's something you need to know," he said quietly. "Something I didn't tell you before." Her stomach sank. "What is it?" "The Reapers have been under investigation for months," he said. "They're tied to a series of incidents, intimidation, theft, even a few cases of arson. But there's something specific about Dominic Kane. He doesn't usually bother with random targets. If he's singled you out, there's a reason." Lisa's mind raced, the weight of his words sinking in. "I don't understand," she said. "I've never met him before. I don't have any connection to these people." Moore looked at her carefully, as if trying to piece something together. "Are you sure?" he asked. "No chance you crossed paths with them, knowingly or unknowingly?" Lisa shook her head. I'm sure. I'd remember if I did. Moore nodded slowly, though his expression remained troubled. Then we're missing something, he said. Because Dominic Kane doesn't do anything without a purpose. Lisa's chest tightened. The idea that this wasn't random, that there was some deliberate reason behind it all, made her feel even more vulnerable. But it also fueled her determination. She couldn't just sit back and let this happen. If there was a reason she'd been targeted, she needed to find out what it was. As Moore walked her to her door, Lisa couldn't shake the feeling that the night wasn't over yet. Even as she locked the door behind her and double-checked the windows, the unease lingered. She sat on the couch, staring at her laptop, the photo of Dominic Kane still open on the screen. His cold eyes seemed to stare back at her, challenging her to unravel the mystery he had left in his wake. She knew she was teetering on the edge of something dangerous, something much bigger than herself. But there was no turning back now. Whatever the Reapers wanted, whatever Dominic Kane's intentions were, Lisa was determined to face them. She just didn't know if she was ready for what she might discover. The faint sound of an engine revving outside made her flinch. Her pulse quickened as she moved to the window, careful not to be seen. There, parked under the streetlight, was a single motorcycle. The rider sat motionless, his helmet reflecting the dim glow. Lisa's heart pounded as she realized he wasn't there by accident. He was waiting for her. Lisa's breath caught as she watched the lone biker sitting under the streetlight, his presence eerily calm. The metallic sheen of his helmet reflected the orange glow, concealing his face entirely. He wasn't moving, and that stillness unnerved her more than any chase or threat could. Whoever he was, he wanted her to know he was there. Her first instinct was to call Officer Moore, but she hesitated. Something about this felt different. This wasn't like the group she'd encountered before, revving their engines and trying to intimidate her. This was deliberate, calculated. She stayed by the window, barely breathing, as she weighed her options. Suddenly, the rider reached up and removed his helmet. Lisa's heart skipped a beat as his face came into view, not Dominic Kane, but someone else entirely. A younger man, with sharp features and piercing eyes that seemed to look directly at her window. He didn't look threatening, but there was something about his expression, calm, almost resigned, that sent a chill down her spine. And then, he did something she didn't expect. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a piece of paper, holding it up so she could see. Even from a distance, Lisa could make out the bold, scrawled letters. "We need to talk." Her mind raced. Every instinct screamed at her to stay inside, to call for help, but curiosity burned brighter than fear. Who was this man? What did he want? And why did he look like he was trying to warn her rather than intimidate her? Lisa grabbed her phone and slipped it into her pocket, just in case, before cautiously heading to the door. Her hands trembled as she unlocked it and stepped out onto the porch. The biker didn't move, his eyes still fixed on her. "What do you want?" she called out, keeping her distance. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "But you're in danger. Real danger." Lisa narrowed her eyes, crossing her arms to hide the fact that her hands were shaking. "Yeah, I kind of figured that out already. Who are you?" He hesitated for a moment before answering. "My name's Nate," he said. "And I used to be one of them. The Reapers." The admission hit her like a punch to the gut. She took an involuntary step back, her mind reeling. "If you're one of them, why should I believe anything you say?" "I said used to be, asterisk," Nate corrected, his tone sharp. "I left months ago, but not before I saw how Dominic works. He doesn't just pick targets at random, and he doesn't let things go once he's started. If he's coming after you, there's a reason. And if I'm right, you don't have much time." Lisa's pulse quickened. "What reason? I don't know him. I don't know any of you." Nate shook his head. "It's not about what you know. It's about what you might have, or what he thinks you have." The cryptic statement only deepened her confusion. "You're not making any sense," she said, frustration edging into her voice. "Dominic's not just a biker," Nate said, lowering his voice as he glanced around the quiet street. "The Reapers are into a lot of things, illegal races, smuggling, extortion. But Dominic, he's always looking for leverage. Information, blackmail, anything he can use to stay one step ahead of the law. If he's fixated on you, it's because he thinks you've got something he wants." Lisa's stomach churned. "I don't have anything. I'm just a graphic designer, for crying out loud. I don't even know how I got dragged into this." Nate stepped closer, his expression softening. "Think," he urged. Have you seen something, overheard something? Anything that might connect you to him or the Reapers? Lisa racked her brain, trying to piece together any fragment of her life that might explain this. Nothing stood out, at least, not until she remembered the name of the client whose logo she'd been redesigning just last week. A local business owner with a shady reputation, someone Clara had jokingly called trouble in a suit. Her breath hitched. Could that be it? Could her work have inadvertently tied her to something she had no idea about? Before she could say anything, the distant rumble of motorcycles filled the air again, this time louder and more aggressive. Nate's head snapped toward the sound, his expression hardening. "They're coming," he said, his voice tense. "You need to decide right now. Are you going to trust me, or are you going to face them alone?" Lisa's mind raced as the roar of the engines grew closer. She didn't trust Nate, not entirely, but the fear in his eyes was real. And if he was right, staying here wasn't an option. "Okay," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do we do?" "Get on," Nate said, gesturing to his bike. "We can't outrun them for long, but I know a place where we can hide. At least until we figure this out." Lisa hesitated for only a second before nodding. She climbed onto the back of his bike, gripping tightly as he revved the engine. As they sped off into the night, the headlights of the Reaper's motorcycles appeared in the distance, closing in fast. The chase was on, and Lisa knew she was stepping into something far bigger, and far more dangerous, than she'd ever imagined. Whatever was waiting for her on the other side of this, she wasn't sure she'd come out the same. But for now, all she could do was hold on and hope Nate was telling the truth. The wind whipped against Lisa's face as Nate's motorcycle sped through the narrow streets. The roar of the Reaper's bikes was growing louder behind them, their headlights cutting through the darkness like predatory eyes. Lisa clung tightly to Nate, her heart hammering in her chest. Every turn felt sharper, every second stretched to an eternity. She didn't know if they were outrunning danger or racing straight into it. Nate navigated the winding streets with practiced precision, but the Reapers were relentless. As they reached the edge of town, the streetlights became sparse, and the shadows deepened. Lisa glanced back and saw the group closing the gap, Dominic Kane unmistakable at the front, his presence an unshakable force even in the chaos. "Nate, they're getting closer." Lisa shouted over the noise, her voice laced with panic. "Hold on," Nate called back, his tone grim. He veered sharply onto an overgrown path that led into the woods, the tires skidding briefly before finding traction on the uneven ground. The sudden turn caught the Reapers off guard, giving Nate and Lisa a precious few seconds of distance. The dense forest swallowed them in darkness, the trees forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. Nate killed the bike's headlights, plunging them into near-total blackness. "We need to lose them in here," he said, his voice low but urgent. Lisa's breathing was shallow, her mind racing. She could hear the distant growl of the Reaper's bikes as they entered the woods, their engines echoing ominously. Nate guided the motorcycle through the trees with an almost instinctual ease, weaving through narrow gaps and avoiding low-hanging branches. Finally, he pulled the bike to a stop in a small clearing, motioning for Lisa to dismount. "We can't stay on the bike," he whispered. "They'll hear it." Lisa slid off, her legs shaky but her resolve steady. Nate pushed the motorcycle into a cluster of bushes to hide it, then turned to her. "Follow me. Stay quiet." They moved quickly but carefully, the forest around them alive with the distant sounds of pursuit. Nate led Lisa to an old, crumbling structure, an abandoned hunting cabin, its walls partially overtaken by moss and vines. He gestured for her to go inside, and she hesitated only for a moment before stepping in. The cabin smelled of damp wood and decay, but it offered a temporary refuge. Nate closed the door behind them, his eyes scanning the room as he whispered, "We'll wait here until they pass. They'll lose their nerve eventually." But Lisa wasn't so sure. She could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the danger pressing down on her. And then, just as she was about to speak, a loud crash echoed from somewhere outside. "They're close," Nate muttered, his jaw tightening. Lisa's fear turned to frustration. "Why are they doing this?" she demanded in a hushed tone. "What could they possibly want from me?" Nate hesitated, his expression conflicted. Finally, he said, "I think Dominic believes you've got evidence, something incriminating, something that could take him and the Reapers down. And if he thinks you have it, he won't stop until he gets it." Lisa shook her head. "That doesn't make sense. I don't have anything like that." Nate stared at her, his brow furrowed. You said you're a graphic designer, right? Do you ever handle sensitive files? Anything that might have crossed your desk without you realizing it? Lisa's mind reeled, and then it hit her like a bolt of lightning, the client from last week. The shady businessman. She'd redesigned his logo, but she'd also been sent several other files as references. She hadn't thought much of them at the time, but could they have contained something Dominic wanted? I think I know what this is about, she said, her voice trembling. She quickly explained the situation to Nate, her words tumbling out in a rush. Nate listened intently, his expression darkening. If those files are what I think they are, you've got leverage. But it's a double-edged sword. Dominic will stop at nothing to get them, but if we play this right, we might be able to use them against him. Before Lisa could respond, the sound of footsteps outside froze her in place. They were no longer dealing with the growl of engines. Dominic and his men were on foot now, closing in. Nate motioned for Lisa to stay quiet as he moved toward the window. Peering out cautiously, he whispered, "They're splitting up. Looking for us." Lisa's heart raced as she considered their options. They couldn't stay in the cabin. It was only a matter of time before they were found. She glanced at Nate, her fear mixing with determination. "We need to end this," she said, her voice steadier than she expected. "If Dominic thinks I have what he's looking for, then let's use it." Nate frowned. "You're talking about baiting him?" Lisa nodded. "If we can get him alone, away from his crew, maybe we can figure out what he's really after. And if I do have something he wants, I'll give him a choice, leave me alone, or I'll take it to the authorities." Nate hesitated, clearly torn. But the sound of another branch snapping outside forced his hand. "Okay," he said, "but this is risky. You have to trust me. I don't have much of a choice, do I?" Lisa replied, her voice tinged with both fear and resolve. Nate nodded, a small smirk breaking through his serious demeanor. "Fair enough." He led Lisa out of the cabin through a back entrance, moving silently as they put distance between themselves and the approaching reapers. As they made their way deeper into the woods, Lisa felt a strange sense of clarity. The fear was still there, but it was tempered by a growing determination. They found another small clearing, and Nate handed Lisa his phone. "Call Moore," he said. "Tell him where we are. If things go south, we'll need backup." Lisa dialed quickly, keeping her voice low as she relayed the information. When she hung up, she turned to Nate. "Now what?" "Now," Nate said, his expression hardening, "we wait for Dominic to take the bait." The final confrontation was inevitable, and as the sound of footsteps grew closer again, Lisa braced herself for whatever came next. What she didn't expect, though, was the sudden realization that she might hold more power in this situation than she'd thought. Whatever secrets Dominic Kane was chasing, Lisa was ready to face them, and him, head on. The clearing felt like a bubble of silence, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. Lisa's heart pounded in her chest as she clutched Nate's phone in one hand, her eyes scanning the shadows for movement. Nate stood beside her, his body tense and ready, as if he could sense the storm about to hit. The footsteps were deliberate now, drawing closer, each one amplifying the weight of the moment. And then, Dominic Kane stepped into the clearing. He was calm, too calm, his imposing figure silhouetted against the faint moonlight filtering through the trees. His leather jacket caught the light, and the faint smirk on his face sent a shiver down Lisa's spine. Behind him, a few of his men lingered in the shadows, but it was clear that Dominic was in charge. "You've made this more difficult than it needed to be," Dominic said, his voice smooth and controlled. His eyes flicked to Nate. "I should have known you'd stick your nose in this, traitor." "Cut the drama, Dominic," Nate shot back. "We both know why you're here. Let's end this." Dominic's gaze shifted to Lisa, his expression hardening. "You've got something of mine," he said. "I don't care how you got it or if you even know what it is. You're going to hand it over, right here, right now." Lisa swallowed hard, her fear momentarily paralyzing her. But then she remembered the files on her laptop. The ones she'd thought were harmless, nothing more than part of a client project. Somewhere in those files was the leverage Dominic was so desperate to find. And if she played her cards right, she could turn the tables. "I don't have the files with me," she said, forcing her voice to stay steady. "But I know what you're looking for. And I'm not just going to give it to you." Dominic's smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, menacing glare. "This isn't a negotiation," he said, taking a step closer. "You don't understand who you're dealing with." "I think I do," Lisa replied, surprising even herself with the firmness in her tone. "You're a bully who uses fear to get what he wants. But not this time." The tension in the air was electric. Dominic's men shifted uneasily in the background, their confidence wavering as they watched the confrontation unfold. Nate, standing protectively in front of Lisa, spoke up again. "You're not walking out of here with what you want, Dominic," Nate said. "Not unless you want the cops breathing down your neck. They're already on their way." For the first time, Dominic's composure faltered. He glanced around, as if expecting sirens to break the silence at any moment. His jaw tightened, and he took another step forward, his hand hovering near his jacket pocket. Lisa's pulse raced. She didn't know if he was reaching for a weapon or trying to intimidate her further, but she refused to back down. Taking a deep breath, she met his gaze head-on. "You can try to scare me all you want," she said. "But if anything happens to me, those files go straight to the authorities. And I guarantee you, they'll find everything they need to shut you down for good." Dominic froze, his eyes narrowing as he processed her words. For a moment, the clearing was so quiet that Lisa could hear her own heartbeat. Then, slowly, Dominic's expression shifted. "Smart," he said, his voice laced with grudging respect. "I didn't think you had it in you." Lisa didn't reply, her stance unyielding. She could feel Nate's silent support beside her, and it gave her the strength to hold her ground. Dominic glanced over his shoulder at his men, then back at Lisa. "This isn't over," he said, his tone dark and threatening. "You think you've won, but you've just made yourself a bigger target." "Maybe," Lisa said, her voice calm despite the fear still coursing through her. "But at least now I know what I'm up against. And I'm not afraid of you anymore." Dominic's smirk returned, but it lacked its earlier confidence. With a sharp motion, he signaled to his men, and they began retreating into the shadows. Lisa watched as Dominic lingered for a moment longer, his eyes boring into hers, before finally turning and disappearing into the darkness. As soon as they were out of sight, Lisa let out a shaky breath, her knees threatening to buckle. Nate caught her arm, steadying her. "You did good," he said, his voice soft but filled with pride. Lisa managed a small, nervous laugh. "I can't believe I just did that." The distant sound of sirens finally broke the tension, and relief washed over her. Officer Moore arrived moments later, his car pulling up to the edge of the clearing. Nate quickly filled him in on what had happened, and Lisa provided the details about the files that had unwittingly put her in Dominic's crosshairs. The next few hours passed in a blur of questions and explanations. Lisa handed over the files to the authorities, who promised to investigate further. Nate stayed by her side through it all, his steady presence a comfort amidst the chaos. When the sun finally began to rise, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, Lisa found herself sitting on the steps of her porch, exhaustion weighing heavily on her. Nate sat beside her, the two of them sharing a quiet moment of reflection. "You were right," Lisa said after a while. "This wasn't just about me. It was bigger than I realized." Nate nodded. "Dominic's dangerous, but he's not invincible. What you did tonight might be the beginning of the end for him." Lisa looked at him, her expression thoughtful. "What about you? Are you going to be okay?" "If Dominic knows you helped me, I'll handle it," Nate said, cutting her off gently. "I've been running from him for a long time. Maybe it's time I stopped." Lisa smiled faintly, appreciating his courage. "Thank you," she said. "For everything." He shrugged, a small grin tugging at his lips. "Couldn't let you face him alone, could I?" As the morning light grew brighter, Lisa felt a sense of closure settling over her. The fear that had consumed her for days was still there, but it was tempered by a newfound strength. She had faced one of the most terrifying experiences of her life and come out the other side stronger, braver. And though she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, Dominic's threat still lingering in the back of her mind, she was determined to move forward. She wasn't just a victim anymore. She was someone who had stood up for herself and refused to back down, no matter the odds. As Nate got up to leave, he paused, looking back at her. "You've got guts, Lisa," he said. "Don't lose that." Lisa watched him walk away, feeling a sense of gratitude she couldn't quite put into words. And as she sat there, watching the world wake up around her, she knew one thing for sure: she would never let fear control her again. It wasn't just about surviving the night. It was about reclaiming her life, one step at a time. And for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to do just that.